This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Laine, and this is episode 95, Darisabel Baez. The day after her second birthday, Darisabel Baez was rushed to the hospital in York, Pennsylvania, covered in so many bruises that her appearance was likened to camouflage by first responders. After Darisabel died from her injuries, her mother, Neida Baez, and Neida's boyfriend, Harve Johnson, were arrested and ultimately charged with murder. This is the story of another child whose life was cut short by her mother's live-in boyfriend. It's also the story of a little girl whose savage beating death by a video game controller and her own hiking boot must not be what we remember best about her, or the reason her memory lives on. This is the tragic story of Darisabel Baez. Before I get into the story, I'd like to take a moment to thank my newest patrons, Jordan Z. from Durham, New Hampshire, Wanda S. from Sumter, South Carolina, Hannah from Arlington, Texas, Tina H. from Van Buren, Ohio, Amanda S. from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Kara M. from South St. Paul, Minnesota, my lovely friend Essence from the Bronx, New York, and Barbara A. from Parts Unknown. I truly appreciate your support, which gets me closer and closer to my goal of devoting myself full-time to the podcast on a permanent basis. Anyone pledging $5 and over per month gets access to ad-free versions of my regular weekly episodes, and pledges of $10 or more get you access to a small but growing library of Patreon-exclusive bonus minisodes in which I tell the stories of even more children who deserve to be remembered. If you'd like to make a pledge, you can do so at patreon.com/stlcpod. As you may have noticed, I took a couple weeks off from the podcast to at least attempt to get myself into a good headspace to start the new year. Whether I succeeded or not remains to be seen, but in the meantime, it's good to be back. I hope you all had a peaceful, joy-filled holiday season and a happy new year. With that, it's been a while since I covered a new case, so let's get into Darisabel's story. Around November of 2007, 19-year-old Neida Elizabeth Baez, who lived in York, Pennsylvania with her mother, Margarita Torres Leon, and her stepfather, Luis Arturo Leon, began dating 26-year-old Harve Lamar Johnson. Unlike many of the perpetrators I've talked about on this podcast, Harve only had a minor criminal record stemming from what appears to be a single incident that took place in 2006 when he was pulled over and charged with driving without a license, possessing a small amount of marijuana, and providing false identification to a law enforcement officer. For reasons that remain unclear, Neida's parents were less than impressed with their daughter's new boyfriend, and before long, they were so fed up with him that they kicked Neida out of their home. Neida, her young daughter Darisabel, and Harve ended up moving into a second-floor apartment located in a row house at 710 West Philadelphia Street in York. On Saturday, April 5, 2008, Darisabel Leanna Baez turned 2 years old. The little girl with a head full of dark hair and stunning brown eyes, whose family affectionately called her Dari, was named after her paternal grandmother, Darisabel Baez, who passed away in 1995. The day after Darisabel's second birthday, Sunday, April 6, 2008, Neida called for an ambulance, telling authorities that her boyfriend, Harve, had brought her daughter to her, unconscious, limp, and wet from a supposed attempt to revive her in the bathtub. First responders to the unusual call of a 2-year-old in cardiac arrest were stunned by the extent of Darisabel's injuries. The first officer on the scene, York City Police Officer Roger Nestor, described the bruises covering her body as appearing like camouflage. The same officer encountered Harve in the first-floor vestibule of the second-floor apartment, saying the man was texting and barely mumbled an answer to the officer's question about where the victim was located. Shortly after police arrived on the scene, Harve fled to his brother's house on the same block. Even in the dim light of the apartment, police and EMTs were shocked by the sheer number of injuries covering Darisabel's naked body. When EMT supervisor Donald Sanders Jr. insisted Darisabel be taken immediately to the hospital, Officer Andy Baez, no relation, cradled the little girl to his chest and carried her down the stairs and outside, where a gaggle of neighbors had collected. Later in this episode, you'll hear Detective Baez's raw emotion as he describes protecting Darisabel's naked, battered body from all of their staring eyes. Darisabel was rushed by ambulance to York Hospital's trauma bay, suffering from a variety of bruises and other injuries. It was obvious to everyone who saw her that she had been severely abused, and not just once. It was determined that the little girl was brain dead, and she was transferred to Penn State Hershey Medical Center's critical care unit, where she was placed on life support. Neida was questioned at the scene, first telling police Darisabel had fallen in the bathtub, but the officers knew immediately she was lying based on the severe injuries they had seen on Darisabel's body. Neida then shifted her story, saying her 2-year-old daughter's injuries were caused by a fall down the stairs. She continued to insist her daughter's injuries were accidental, and she was eventually taken to the York City Police Department for further questioning. Crime scene investigators found blood spatter on the wall next to Darisabel's makeshift bed, which was thrown together using a sheet, 2 blankets, and a baby blanket on the floor. In addition to the blood spatter, they also discovered 2 clumps of hair near the bed and another clump of hair in the kitchen near a pile of Darisabel's clothing. Investigators were very interested in speaking with Harve Johnson, but first they'd have to find him. Sergeant Roy Kohler located Harve at a nearby laundromat, talking on the phone to a dispatcher, and took him as well to police headquarters, where he was interviewed by Detective Matt Luchko at 8:55 that evening. In the transcript of the interview, Harve and the detective both refer to Neida as Elizabeth, which is her middle name. When asked what had happened earlier that day, Harve told the detective that between 5:30 and 6 o'clock that morning, Darisabel came into the couple's bedroom, which was also the living room of the apartment, and he told Darisabel to stand in the corner until they got up, which he said was a standard punishment for getting up too early. He awoke to a text between 11:30 and noon, at which point he said he went outside to check on his car. When he came back inside, he said, "Elizabeth was aggravated and frustrated, and I asked her why, and she wouldn't answer me. So I assumed Darisabel was playing on the stairs again like she was doing 2 days before and the day before. So I took her in her room and I spanked her for a couple seconds, and I told her in 5 or 10 minutes I'll have a conversation with her." When pressed about the spanking, Harve admitted, "I used my cord from my Nintendo Xbox in her arm. I hit her in her arm. I was hitting her chest and her back at the same time, but I was aiming for her arm."
Now, when you said you spanked her, what did you use to spank her?
I used my cord from my Nintendo.
Your cord?
Xbox.
So you used a cord from the controller of your Xbox. Okay, and where did you hit Darisabel at?
In her arm, and when I hit in her arm, it was hitting my chest and the back at the same time, but I was really aiming for her arm.
How many times do you think you hit her?
Like 7, 8 times.
After hitting Darisabel with the controller cord, he said about 7 or 8 times, Harve said he talked with her for 5 to 10 minutes afterwards. Then, Harve told the detective, he realized Darisabel's diaper was soggy and that, in his words, she was smelling like shit. So he got Neida to change her diaper, which he claimed was bursting apart. And when she changed it, she shit on herself. She took the pamper off, and Elizabeth went to the kitchen. Her mom was angry, and she walked off. After she come up and walked off, so I picked her up and put her in the tub, and I ran the water. Water's already running, and I run the water more. I realized she still had stuff coming out of her back, out of her butt, so I went upstairs to get a onesie, and when I came back, she was asleep in the tub. Detective Luchko asked for clarification, so Harve said, "I went to the attic, the 3rd floor of the house, for some onesies because we just moved in, so everything's in bags still. She was in the tub, face forward, face down like she fell on her face. But she was just fooling, so I didn't suspect so much until I saw her face." The detective asked, "Okay, so she was face down in the tub in the water. How much water was in there, do you think?" Harve replied, "Like it hit her cheek, like coming up on her face, right up to here when she couldn't breathe, like this." When he picked up the toddler, Harve said, he saw a lump on the left side of her forehead and panicked because she wasn't moving or responsive, her eyes half closed, which he said was unusual because normally, he said, she's hyper, she acts like agitated. He said he picked up the toddler and met Neida in the hallway where the couple argued over what to do. After that, we took her to the attic and I put her on my shoulder, took her to the attic. She sat on her mother's leg. Her mother rubbed her back like this, you know what I mean? While I hold her and blow a breath, giving her CPR like this, and water started coming out. So I started rubbing her belly, started rubbing her stomach very hard. Every time you rub her stomach, you would hear her gag, and the water's all coming out. So that's why we kept rubbing her stomach as I was rubbing." The detective interjected, "So every time you started rubbing her belly, you could hear her breathing, but it was—" Harve continued, "It was getting better and better, so I kept rubbing. That's one reason we didn't call the cops. I thought she was going to get better." After about 15 or 20 minutes, Harve said, they took Darisabel and sat in the kitchen. "I'm rubbing her because I was holding her. I was shaking her, wake up, like get up, get up, get up. After that, she woke up for some reason. She got up, she responded, so I'm like, well, she's good. So we go in the kitchen. I'm holding her and she's breathing, and I give her to her mother. And then I went downstairs to get the phone because my phone wasn't going through, I guess. And then I got the kid's phone. I didn't use it. I tried to use it, but after I was using it, she started breathing, so I'm like, let's just leave it, see what happens first." After he retrieved the neighbor's phone, Harve said, Neida screamed again. "For some reason, she just screamed, and I'd be like, I'm calling the ambulance. I don't care what happens. I'm calling the ambulance right now because she did scream like she's not responding, so I called the ambulance. Then 911 came. They came. I opened the door for them, and then I left to my brother's house across the street. When I came back from my brother's house, and then I was arrested." He went to his brother's house, Harve said, because he was confused. Detective Luchko asked him if Darisabel's mother said anything to him earlier while he was beating the toddler, to which Harve answered, "She told me that stop hitting her, but it's discipline. When we discipline, she gets beat sometimes, and she also have to walk spaces, but Elizabeth's pregnant right now, so she's more emotional than me, so anything, just stop, please. That's how she was, just stop, leave her alone. Because I didn't want to hear her mouth, just leave her alone."
Did Elizabeth say anything to you earlier when this beating was happening?
She told me before that anyway, stop saying this, because like it's discipline. We did it like she get disciplined, she get beat sometimes for not listening. She also has to walk spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But Elizabeth's praying right now, so she's more emotional anyway. So anything she's like, just stop, please. That's how she was. Just stop, leave her alone.
I was not able to find any indication of what happened to the baby Elizabeth was supposedly pregnant with during this interview. The detective then asked Harve to back up and run through the story again to be sure he had all the details. During the run-through, the detective went through the timeline, allowing Harve simply to answer yes as he parroted the story as Harve told it. When he reached the part about Harve placing Darisabel in the bathtub and going upstairs for a onesie, Detective Luchko said, "And that's when you saw that she was unresponsive and there was a bump on the left side of her forehead?" Harve confirmed the statement with a new addition. "Yes, with a gash in it. It was a bump with a gash in it." After Harve went downstairs to retrieve the neighbor's phone, the detective asked, "She was breathing okay at this time?" Harve said, "At the time she was breathing, her eyes dilated again and came back, and she was breathing. I was nervous because of the bruises. I was really nervous of the bruises. That's why I wouldn't take her to the hospital. I didn't want to call the ambulance. I was going to drop her off. I didn't want to get in trouble for the bruises. That's the whole thing of why it took so long to get her to call, because I was concerned about the bruises. I was scared, because she bruises so easy. Look at her mother. If I touch her mother right like that, watch her mother get a bruise. Watch her mother get a bruise for no reason. That's what happens. I don't know what happens." The detective asked if the blood on his shirt was from holding Darisabel on his shoulder as he carried her upstairs after the bathtub incident, which Harve confirmed. He then told the detective that she wasn't allowed to see his own daughter due to his relationship with Neida. "I put a roof over her head because I felt sorry for her. When I first met, she didn't have some of the shit. She didn't have shoes. I had to go buy that stuff, and then my daughter's not with me because of her. My ex-wife hates me because of this girl." His ex-wife, he said, was angry that he ended their 9-year relationship and began dating Neida. "I feel fucked up because I know better about putting her in the tub. I have 3 kids. I know better. But me being frustrated fucked up my shit, plain and simple. I went upstairs because I was frustrated. I don't like disciplining her. She don't listen. Darisabel will fall down the stairs and break her fucking neck." When asked if he was telling the truth, Harve said he was, adding, "I didn't hurt her. I beat her and I stand her up. I mean, I didn't do none of that stuff to her. I was just scared for her, that's why I was so... and I wouldn't do anything. I had a car. I could have drove over there. I could have dropped her at the hospital and just left. Or I could just call the ambulance and stayed at my brother's house and just wait until you all left, and then they got to look for me. But I didn't do that. I chose to come in because I know I didn't do nothing. That's why I'm talking to you right now. If I knew it wasn't an accident, would I be here right now? No, I wouldn't, because I had a chance to leave. I had a chance to get away. I had a chance to drive my car and get away. I had a chance to get on a bus and go to New York, but I didn't because I didn't do nothing." The interview concluded at 9:13 p.m. Harve Johnson was arrested and charged with aggravated assault and reckless endangerment. When Darisabel's mother was questioned by police, she told Detective Matt Luchko she tried to get into the room where Harve was beating Darisabel, saying, "She's crying. She's crying. I'm telling him to stop. Just leave her alone." Neida said that at one point, she entered the room to find her daughter curled up in the corner crying, with a lump on her head and a cut above one eye. Her boyfriend told her if she didn't leave, she would just make things worse, so she left the room. York City Police Detective First Class Dana Ward, supervisor of the department's Child Abuse Investigation Unit, said that during her interview, Neida was very emotional, sobbing and frequently asking for updates on her daughter's condition. The police were ready to release Neida so she could attend her daughter's bedside in the hospital until they received notification from the crime scene team, which had located a journal that indicated Neida was more involved in Darisabel's abuse than her statement suggested. At that point, she was taken into custody. On Sunday evening, police and other first responders attended a stress debriefing meeting to help them cope with their overwhelming emotions after witnessing the aftermath of Darisabel's brutal abuse. Detective Ward said, "Any time a child is injured, it is very difficult for patrol officers and emergency personnel. I think that's important to keep in mind, and we will hear more about that later in the episode." Darisabel languished on life support in the hospital for over 30 hours. According to Detective Ward, she never regained any kind of consciousness. At 9:28 p.m. on Monday, April 7, 2008, Darisabel was pronounced dead, just 2 days after her second birthday. An autopsy the following morning ruled the little girl's death a homicide. According to the initial autopsy report, Darisabel's body bore multiple visible injuries, including bruises on her forehead, both eyes, face, shoulders, arms, fingers, chest, back, side, legs, and feet, missing fingernails and blackened fingertips, swelling and a laceration on her forehead, a cut on her left eye, injuries inside her mouth, and a swollen finger. I couldn't help gasping aloud when I saw the anatomical diagram mapping out all of Darisabel's injuries. There was barely enough room on the diagram to list them all. All in all, over 150 injuries were detailed in the initial autopsy report. After Darisabel died, a murder charge was quickly added to the list of crimes against Harve Johnson. Her mother, Neida, was charged with endangering the welfare of a child, accused of overhearing her daughter's fatal beating but failing to intervene until she realized Darisabel was unconscious. She told police that her boyfriend had beaten Darisabel in the past and that on Sunday she heard her daughter scream while Harve beat her. According to Detective Dana Ward, Neida was charged due to her lack of action by either intervening in the beating or trying to get help for her daughter. She heard the beating take place. Her crime is she did nothing to protect her child. Both were booked into the York County Prison with bail set at $200,000 for Harve and $25,000 for Neida, whose bail was later raised to $100,000. Dauphin County Coroner Graham Hetrick told WGAL-TV that April 6th was clearly not the first time Darisabel suffered abuse. Her death was, he said, one of the worst cases of child abuse he had ever seen. Neighbors who witnessed the scene outside the row house on Sunday afternoon saw the bruises all over Darisabel, who was still and silent. Adriana Clark told a York Daily Record reporter, "She wasn't crying, she wasn't whimpering. She didn't have a chance at life." Other neighbors added to a small memorial on the sidewalk consisting of candles and teddy bears. April Gauchenor said she saw Neida and Darisabel just once as they got into a car, adding, "That little girl was so pretty." Darisabel's funeral was held on Saturday, April 12th at 10 a.m. at Cooner Associates Funeral Directors on South George Street in York, where she was remembered as both a flower pulled too soon and a sparrow fallen to the ground. Law enforcement and emergency personnel attended the funeral, later saying they don't normally go to the funerals of the victims they assist, but they were all so touched by Darisabel's death that they felt compelled to attend hers. Before the service, Darisabel's maternal grandfather, Wilfredo Baez of Miami, Florida, told a reporter he had only seen his granddaughter 3 times. "I didn't get to spend enough time with her. I wish this was a bad dream, for real." During the funeral, Darisabel's godfather, Luis Rivera, said to the family and friends gathered to remember the little girl, "Darisabel was an angel, a beautiful angel. We have to remember her for all the good times she had." Darisabel's eyes, her godfather said, affected everyone she met. Her aunt, Maria Cruz, said during the service, "If anyone knows of someone abusing a kid, please don't stay quiet. Please tell someone." The Reverend Aaron Anderson, at that time the assistant pastor of Providence Presbyterian Church, told the crowd, "Darisabel is in the arms of Jesus right now. No one can harm that little girl ever again." After her funeral service, Darisabel was laid to rest in the Cherub Garden section of Mount Rose Cemetery. At the cemetery, mourners sang hymns and cried, leaving white balloons on the ground near Darisabel's tiny white casket, which was covered in pink flowers. Three months after Darisabel's death, Neida's charge of endangering the welfare of a child was withdrawn by Detective First Class Dana Ward, who filed a new charge of homicide against the murdered child's mother. District Judge Richard Martin arraigned the woman by video teleconference to avoid transporting her to and from jail, and during that brief hearing, her bail was revoked. At a court hearing in August of 2008, York City police officer Lisa Daniels testified about the afternoon just 4 months earlier when she responded to 710 West Philadelphia Street and found the battered, unresponsive body of baby Darisabel lying naked on the kitchen floor, covered in bruises in varying stages of healing, including some that were clearly fresh. The child was covered in bruises from head to toe. Officer Daniels testified that when she arrived on the scene, she found Neida Baez, the child's mother, sobbing on the floor at Darisabel's feet. Dr. Wayne Ross, the forensic pathologist who conducted Darisabel's autopsy, wrote in his report, "The beating was extensive and indicative of torture." The report detailed traumatic injuries all over Darisabel's body, including her chest, heart, liver, head, and brain. Neida's public defender, Clesina Mahoney, asked the judge to drop her client's murder charge, saying Neida tried to stop Harve from beating Darisabel and was afraid her boyfriend would hurt her or ramp up his beatings on her daughter if she did intervene. Her client, Mahoney told the judge, did try to revive Darisabel by performing CPR. However, York County Prosecutor Chris Moore told the court that Neida should have done more to protect her innocent toddler. "She did nothing. She did not call police or attempt to stop it." He also pointed out that in Neida's initial story, Darisabel was injured by falling down the stairs. Her story changed only after Officer Daniels said she didn't believe her. The hearing concluded with Judge Richard Martin finding sufficient evidence for both Harve and Neida to stand trial for murder. In his ruling, Judge Martin said Neida failed to protect her daughter, admonishing her, "As a parent, we all have a duty to our children." In August of 2008, the prosecution filed a notice of their intent to seek the death penalty against Harve Johnson, listing Darisabel's age and torture as aggravating circumstances. They did not intend to seek the death penalty against Neida for her murder charge. 25 years prior to Darisabel's death, another child abuse murder rocked York County, Pennsylvania, when 5-year-old Alita Bailey was beaten to death by her mother's boyfriend while her father, Cameron Bailey, was away for military training. Alita was beaten so far beyond recognition that police couldn't initially determine the child's race. After Darisabel's murder, Alita's name often came up, the story a reminder that these horrible things can happen anywhere. If York County residents needed another reminder, they got it when 2-year-old Dante Mullenix, whose story I covered in episodes 76 and 77, died from a traumatic brain injury with strangulation and chest compression. He also suffered from an as-yet unexplained active case of HSV-2 or herpes. His mother's boyfriend, 40-year-old Tyree Bowie, awaits trial for Dante's murder, and Dante's mother, 22-year-old Leah Mullenix, was charged with endangering the welfare of children. Upon re-examination of photographs of Darisabel's body, pathologist Dr. Wayne Ross discovered additional injuries, leading to another court hearing to get his testimony on the record. At a pretrial hearing in March of 2009, Dr. Ross spent nearly an hour on the stand testifying about the now 225 injuries he detailed in Darisabel's amended autopsy report. According to Dr. Ross, to incur such a large number of injuries, the fatal beating would have to have lasted a minimum of 45 minutes. Dr. Ross testified, 45 minutes to an hour, maybe longer. I believe I'm being conservative when I say an hour. The injuries detailed included extensive trauma and contusions, bruises, abrasions, and swelling all over Darisabel's body from her scalp to her feet. None of her bones were broken, Dr. Ross testified, but he found distinctive marks on her body from being whipped by the cord of a video game controller that he stated was moving at a velocity exceeding 20 miles per hour. One more horrific detail that I wish I didn't have to mention was that Dr. Ross also testified that photos taken of Darisabel at York Hospital showed injuries to her genitalia. When enlarged, the photos clearly depicted fingernail marks in that area, and the position and number of marks indicated Darisabel had been repeatedly pinched in her genital area. Also at the hearing, over which Judge Michael J. Brillhart presided, prosecutors Timothy Barker and Christopher Moore asked to amend their death penalty notice to include the aggravating circumstance of aggravated indecent assault in light of the new evidence of torture to Darisabel's genital area. They also sought to add aggravated indecent assault as a new charge against Harve. On the one-year anniversary of Darisabel's death, Pastor Aaron Anderson of City Church in York, one of the pastors who conducted Darisabel's funeral services and the father of a little girl who used to play with Darisabel, wrote a blog post on the church's website to memorialize the little girl. In part, Pastor Anderson wrote of the church, "We intend to make Darisabel's life count by taking the transforming power of the gospel to people who might otherwise end up with the same fate as Harve Johnson and Neida Baez. Just maybe some family that is touched by the gospel will stop using violence, drugs, and sex to solve their problems, and turn their energy toward loving each other and their own little ones like Darisabel." City Church was, in fact, founded after Darisabel's death, which the pastor said, "dropped on us like a ton of bricks. Call it a sign, call it what you want." Pastor Anderson said his new church would focus on those who were underserved and would attempt to address the issues of child abuse and violence. "You think of kids, you think of the issues the city faces like poverty. This is just a stinging example of the need that's out there in the city right now." Whenever the pastor looked at his daughter, Amelia, who would turn 3 in June of 2010, he couldn't help thinking about her former playmate. "I try to shower all my kids with love and affection, but something about seeing a little 3-year-old, Darisabel, comes to mind. It's heartbreaking. I hold her and kiss her a little more." The Andersons lived next door to Darisabel's maternal grandparents, Luis Leone and Margarita Torres Leone, on Madison Avenue in York. Margarita told the York Daily Record of the pastor's daughter, Amelia, "She's my little one. I love that little girl. Seeing her growing is like seeing Darisabel." For the anniversary of their granddaughter's death, the Leones took flowers to her grave in Mount Rose Cemetery and prayed for her. The couple told the York Daily Record that the year since Darisabel's death had been difficult for them. Margarita said she still thought about her granddaughter, who lived with them until a few months before she died, every day. She was at Darisabel's bedside when she was removed from life support at Hershey Medical Center, and she still had the pink blanket that covered Darisabel in the hospital, as well as a heart-shaped mold of her granddaughter's handprint, which the hospital thoughtfully made for her the day Darisabel died. I'll include a photo of the handprint mold in the Facebook photo album for this episode. Margarita said of Darisabel, "She was so beautiful, so happy. She was a happy baby." Her daughter, Neida, loved children, especially her own daughter, but sometime after Neida began dating Harve Johnson in November of 2007, Margarita said, she was no longer allowed to see her granddaughter. "I knew something was not right." The hardest part was learning during court hearings about the extent of some of Darisabel's injuries, of which Margarita said she couldn't imagine how anyone could inflict such pain on a little girl. "I don't even know how to explain." Luis, Neida's stepfather, told the reporter that it helped to be surrounded by good people, including Pastor Anderson, who they considered their pastor, friend, and marriage counselor. Margarita, Luis said, wanted to help raise awareness about child abuse and provide help to young mothers with no support. She wants to get involved and help prevent this from happening again. Prior to the joint trial of both Harve and Neida, Harve's defense team submitted a lengthy pretrial motion challenging the charges against him, his incriminating statements to police, and the constitutionality of the death penalty, calling the latter cruel and unusual punishment. In October of 2009, the vast majority of his motions were denied. That same month, Judge Michael Brillhart denied Neida's request to dismiss the charges against her due to lack of evidence. A week later, 21-year-old Neida Elizabeth Baez pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, a charge unique to only 3 states, including Pennsylvania, Florida, and Minnesota. In exchange for truthful testimony against her co-defendant, Harve Johnson, Neida was expected to receive a prison sentence of 5 to 10 years in state prison. The typical sentence for third-degree murder in Pennsylvania is 20 to 40 years. Prosecutor Timothy Barker said, "The basis for her guilty plea was her omission of care in protecting Darisabel Baez. She had a duty to care for her under the parent-child relationship. And it was not just for the day in question, but the days and months before that, for failing to remove her daughter from an abusive household. Barker said Naida's failure to protect Darisabel showed a recklessness and extreme indifference to the value of human life. He also said Neida failed to seek medical attention for Darisabel in a timely fashion, instead attempting to perform CPR on her daughter herself, and her attempts were woefully short. During the plea hearing, Neida admitted to Judge Brillhart that Darisabel was beaten by Harve Johnson for months prior to her death. At the same hearing, Judge Brillhart denied the prosecution's request to add aggravated indecent assault to the charges against Harve Johnson. In his ruling, the judge said that the new charge had a different factual basis from the original charge. The trial of Harve Lamar Johnson began on November 9, 2009, with Judge Brillhart presiding. Prosecuting on behalf of the state were Timothy Barker and Chris Moore, and defending Harve were attorneys Rick Robinson and Ari Weitzman. Upon sitting down at the defense table, Harve, a ridiculously spineless excuse for a man, stuffed his ears with tissues and put his head down on the table so he didn't have to watch the emotional witnesses testify or see any other evidence of his own disgusting acts. Due to a pretrial ruling by the judge, the prosecution was not allowed to use the word torture to describe the abuse Darisabel endured. The first 3 witnesses to testify were 3 of the first responders to the apartment on April 6, 2008. York City police officers Andy Baez, Lisa Daniels, and Roger Nestor all fought back tears as they told the court about finding Darisabel's tiny, battered body on the kitchen floor. Officer Baez testified that after he and Officer Daniels performed CPR on Darisabel and were unable to establish breathing or a pulse, he picked her up and ran with her down the stairs to the waiting ambulance. "I don't remember touching one step. I went out the front door. It seemed like so many people outside who had nothing to do with this. I looked at her. That's when it really hit me. I was holding her up to my chest so no one could see her. I covered her just to shield her. I didn't want no one to see her." After placing Darisabel into the ambulance, Officer Baez testified, "I rubbed her hand, trying to give her any bit of life I could. That's when I saw her nails were gone." Sergeant Roy Kohler testified that after Darisabel was taken away by ambulance, he was contacted by County Control and told that Harve Johnson was on the phone with a dispatcher and could be located at a nearby laundromat. He was breathing very rapidly, almost hyperventilating. While Sergeant Kohler led Harve to his squad car, Harve told him, "I know I'm in trouble because of all the bruises all over her body. I beat her pretty bad with a belt yesterday." On the way to the police station, Harve told Sergeant Kohler, "That girl and her mother bruise when I touch them at all. If I bite her mother or hit Darisabel at all, they bruise right up." White Rose Ambulance EMT Supervisor Donald J. Sanders, Jr. testified that he examined Harve in the squad car. During his examination, Harve told the man, "I've been beating her with a belt. I'm sorry, I did it. I've been hitting the child for the last 2 or 3 days." When Sanders asked what he used to hit Darisabel, Harve replied, "A belt." Prior to the beginning of Day 2 of the trial, it seemed possible that a plea agreement was in the works, and testimony was briefly delayed. The negotiations failed to end in an agreement, however, and one of Harve's attorneys, Ari Weitzman, told Judge Brillhart, "We're continuing with the trial." Before testimony commenced, however, Harve asked to be excused from the courtroom before a series of 18 black and white photos of Darisabel's extensive and brutal injuries were shown to the jury. Fortunately, Judge Brillhart determined through lengthy discussion and research that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had previously made a ruling that a defendant on trial for a capital crime must remain in the courtroom throughout his trial. At last, forensic nurse Patty O'Brien, who took the photos of Darisabel's numerous injuries at York Hospital, took the stand. The defendant once again put his head down on the table and plugged his ears with his thumbs as if to prove he's a truly pathetic sack of dog excrement. On top of that, while photographs were shown, he rocked back and forth and wept at the defense table. Nurse O'Brien told the court she documented more than 72 cuts and bruises on Darisabel's body, and that the injury diagram she used did not have enough space to notate all of the little girl's injuries. Even more gruesome than the bruises covering every part of Darisabel's body were the numerous whip marks covering her back and buttocks, at the end of each of which was a small rectangular bruise, likely caused by the plug at the end of the cord used to whip her. After her testimony was complete, Patty O'Brien was so committed to seeing justice served for Darisabel that she returned to watch the completion of the trial. That afternoon, Dr. Wayne K. Ross began 2 days of testimony, during which he said that Darisabel's fatal beating lasted at least 45 minutes, and that based on the number of injuries she suffered, both internal and external, the person who beat her to death would have to inflict an injury every 20 seconds. Of Darisabel's over 220 injuries, Dr. Ross testified, Approximately 150 of them were fresh and had occurred within 24 hours of the initial 911 call. According to court documents, further injuries previously not mentioned included: right ear had fresh trauma, and the center of her right ear had an abrasion consistent with someone scraping a fingernail in her ear. Victim's hair on the right side of her head was pulled out by its roots. Injuries on her left shoulder were caused by the cord of the Xbox controller, and her entire left arm was swollen. Dr. Ross also testified to numerous fresh internal injuries to victim's head, including swelling and bleeding in her brain, as well as retinal hemorrhages and damage to her spinal cord. He noted victim suffered trauma to her heart, right lung, liver, pancreas, and right adrenal gland, which were caused by multiple high-velocity impacts to the chest and belly. There were also hemorrhages to her neck caused by compression or strangulation. The bruise to Darisabel's lung, the pathologist said, caused respiratory failure. Dr. Ross surmised that the bruise on the back of Darisabel's heart resulted from a severe blow, either to her back or her chest. If the attacker struck her chest, Dr. Ross testified, the force would have been hard enough to push the heart into the spine, causing the bruise. When asked why none of Darisabel's bones were broken, the pathologist explained that children's skulls and ribs were flexible. Further testimony at the trial indicated that authorities believed Harve beat Darisabel with not only the cord from his Xbox controller, but also a child's hiking boot and his fists. Blood spatter found on a bedroom wall matched Darisabel's DNA, as did blood found on the plug end of the Xbox controller, a child's boot, the sleeveless t-shirt Harve was wearing, and the hair clumps found near Darisabel's bed. Darisabel's blood, as well as impact spatter, was also found on her own clothes. The sole of the boot, according to Dr. Ross, exactly matched a pattern bruise on Darisabel's left cheek. When Neida Baez was called to the stand on November 12th, she caught sight of her mother, Margarita, in the courtroom and mouthed to her, "I love you, Mommy." Margarita later said of the moment, "I was saying to her that I loved her. She is still my daughter." Neida testified emotionlessly about the day of her daughter's death and the punishment her then-boyfriend doled out against the helpless little girl after she changed Darisabel's diaper and disposed of her soiled pajamas. "Mr. Johnson grabbed her from me. He started hitting her. I told him to stop. He told me to shut the fuck up. He said she need to learn not to get up that early in the morning." When she was told to do so, Neida testified, she returned to the living room. "I could hear the whistle of the remote control." At times, she could see Harve wielding the Xbox controller. When Darisabel cried out for her mommy, Neida said, she told him to stop, but he did not. The reason she didn't call for help sooner, Neida testified, was because, "I was scared because Harve threatened he would hit me too." During her testimony, Neida was shown 15 of the previously admitted 18 photographs of Darisabel's injuries in order to determine which of the marks and bruises were present prior to the fatal attack, thereby establishing a pattern of abusive behavior on Harve's part toward Darisabel. On cross-examination, Neida admitted that in the past, she too had struck her daughter with a belt and slapped her on the arm. The prosecution contended that the trigger for Harve's attack on Darisabel was a spanking Harve himself inflicted on the little girl, which burst open her soiled diaper and caused a mess on the floor. Closing arguments were heard from both sides on the morning of Friday, December 13, 2009. Defense attorney Rick Robinson told the jury that his client did kill Darisabel Baez. "What you saw was bad. What you heard is bad. What he did is bad. It's criminal." However, Robinson said, Harve did not have the specific intent to kill the toddler he brutally beat with the cord of an Xbox controller and her own boot, which is a requirement for the jury to find a defendant guilty of first-degree murder. "You have to make a finding of what his state of mind was." Prosecutor Tim Barker told the jury during his closing argument, which largely focused on Darisabel's internal injuries rather than her numerous visible external injuries, that Harve's intent could be determined by science and medicine. You don't beat anyone to the head like this. Not when they are already down, not when you already beat them, unless you intend to kill them. The prosecutor referred to Dr. Ross's testimony, reminding the jury of Dr. Ross's opinion that any of the injuries to Darisabel's major organs could have been fatal. "You don't have a death blow here. You have multiple death blows. There were multiple blows to the head, multiple blows to the torso, multiple death blows. There was only one thing going through his mind. He wanted her dead." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning the same day with a verdict. 28-year-old Harve Johnson was found guilty of the first-degree murder of 2-year-old Darisabel Leanna Baez. No time whatsoever was wasted, as Harve's sentencing hearing was scheduled to take place just 3 days later on Monday, November 16th. During the penalty phase of the trial, the prosecution would be allowed to use the word torture to describe Harve's treatment of Darisabel. They planned to argue that both torture and Darisabel's tender age were aggravated circumstances, making Harve deserving of the death penalty. After the verdict was announced, Prosecutor Barker said, "You cannot commit this kind of an act on a 2-year-old and not have in mind, I intend to kill this person." The evidence overwhelmingly supported it. Co-prosecutor Chris Moore said, "Regardless how it plays out next week, he will never breathe free air again. I'm satisfied with that." After the verdict was announced, a reporter spoke with forensic nurse Patty O'Brien, who called Darisabel's case the most horrific beating I've ever seen. She wasn't here to tell her story. Her pictures were able to tell her story. Darisabel's maternal grandparents, Margarita and Luis, told a reporter, "Justice has been served." Margarita added, "She's resting in peace now." When asked if she could forgive Harve Johnson, she replied, "I'm sorry, no. At least now I know he's not going to hurt anybody else." Of her granddaughter, Margarita said Darisabel was a little angel. She was very happy. Naida's defense attorney, First Assistant Public Defender Clasina Mahoney, spoke for her client after Harve was found guilty, saying Naida had attempted suicide while in jail and was heavily medicated for depression during her testimony. "It was not a lack of feeling. It was not a lack of remorse. She will live with that the rest of her life." Defense attorney Ari Weitzman represented Harve on his own during the penalty phase. He called 2 witnesses to testify on Harve's behalf, his sister, Heather Lloyd, and their mother, Cassandra Lloyd, who was extremely hesitant to testify. According to the York Daily Record, Johnson's mother cowered in the back corner of the courtroom, grasping a tissue in one hand. Defense attorney Ari Weitzman went back, took her other hand, and walked her slowly to the witness stand. She clutched the back of his suit coat as they went. On the stand, Cassandra told of raising her children in Spanish Harlem, New York, as a former crack and heroin addict who abused her children. "I beat the hell out of him with anything I could get my hands on, including pieces of Hot Wheels track, belts with big buckles, cords, and a clothing iron." She testified to spending all of her welfare checks in one particular year on drugs, then locking her kids in their room for 2 full days just to avoid facing them on Christmas Day with no presents for them. Interestingly, Cassandra's older son, Heath Lloyd, was in prison in Louisiana, also for murder, leading her to remark, "I'm crazy. I feel like the worst person in the world." Prosecutor Tim Barker told the jury Cassandra's testimony was neither an excuse nor an explanation for the savage abuse Harve visited upon his girlfriend's toddler. "What happened to the defendant in childhood was appalling, but it does not mitigate what he did to Darisabel." Mr. Barker once again reminded the jury of Dr. Ross's testimony about the hour-long beating inflicted upon Darisabel and the dozens of injuries it caused. "This involves the intent to cause substantial pain and suffering." Defense attorney Weitzman, during his closing argument, asked the jury to hand down a sentence of life in prison without parole, telling them that the sheer number of tragedies within this case made him want to vomit. Still, he maintained that his client did not intend to cause Darisabel's death. "I think that we can agree he was angry beyond all belief. He lost his mind and freaked out. But for the craziness of his life, he would not be here. He's hardened. His heart has been ripped out so many stinking times. He came from a place none of us can understand. He's got hell ahead of him regardless of the verdict. I'm not asking for a pass for him. I'm asking you to save his life." The jury was once again sent to deliberate, which only took an hour and 35 minutes before they returned with their decision. The aggravating circumstances, including Darisabel's age and the fact that she was tortured, outweighed the only mitigating circumstance, which was Harve's lack of any significant criminal record. Upon the jury's decision, Judge Brillhart sentenced Harve Lamar Johnson to death in a manner as prescribed by law in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, effectively rendering Harve the 9th York County man on Pennsylvania's death row. After the sentence was handed down, defense attorneys Weitzman and Robinson left the courthouse without comment, as did Darisabel's grandparents, Margarita and Luis. Prosecutor Barker said, "It's a serious and somber task when we have to ask the jury for a verdict of death. It's what justice required. We greatly appreciate the jury weighing everything they had to sit through." Harve's conviction and death sentence were automatically appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, where the justices would examine the evidence to determine if it was sufficient to support the conviction and determine if the circumstances of the crime supported the death penalty. In December of 2009, Neida Baez was sentenced as expected to serve 5 to 10 years in state prison. Harve's direct appeal was decided on April 26, 2012, when the Supreme Court issued a 34-page ruling affirming both Harve's conviction and his sentence. In June of 2013, Harve filed a habeas corpus petition in federal district court, which is a process during which a federal court may review the legality of a person's imprisonment. The petition was subsequently dismissed without prejudice in March of 2014. On July 18, 2013, then-Governor Tom Corbett signed Harve Johnson's execution warrant. His execution by lethal injection was scheduled to take place on September 10th of the same year. However, on July 23, 2013, Harve and his attorney filed an emergency motion for a stay of execution, as well as a petition for post-conviction relief. At the time, Harve was incarcerated in the State Correctional Institution in Greene. A Post-Conviction Relief Act, or PCRA, hearing examines the actions of the defense team prior to and during a defendant's trial in order to determine whether or not the defense essentially fought hard enough for its client. A new trial would be granted in the event that the PCRA hearing determined ineffectiveness of counsel. Judge Michael E. Bortner granted Harve's stay of execution in August of 2013. Due to an absolute mess of court motions, granted extensions, and changing defense attorneys, the matter of Harve's post-conviction relief petition wasn't decided until March of 2021, when it was denied by York County Judge Maria Musty Cook. Less than a month later, Harve's defense attorney, Michael Wiseman, filed a notice of appeal to the Supreme Court. Wiseman is the former chief of the Federal Community Defender Office's Capital Habeas Corpus Unit in Philadelphia, although he was no longer with the organization at the time he began working with Harve, who specifically requested his services. This matter has yet to be decided, but I'll keep my eye on the case and provide updates if and when I find them. In 2010, Jason Plotkin of the York Daily Record produced a heart-wrenching 20-minute documentary, Carrying Darisabel, focused on the emergency personnel who responded to 710 West Philadelphia Avenue on the afternoon of April 6, 2008. I can't recommend this film highly enough, and I'll link to it in the show notes for this episode. It's a stark reminder not only of the horrors of child abuse, but also the personal sacrifices made by each and every member of law enforcement and the medical staff who respond to these calls. A death like Darisabel's isn't easy for anyone to process, but for the people who tried desperately to save this little girl's life, it left scars that will probably stay with them for the rest of their lives. In the film, we hear from York City Police Officer Roger Nestor, who was the first officer on the scene, as well as Officer Lisa Daniels, former officer turned detective Andy Baez, Sergeant Roy Kohler, Detective Dana Ward, Detective Matt Luchko, EMT Supervisor Donald Sanders Jr., and forensic nurse Patty O'Brien, who documented Darisabel's injuries at the hospital. Everyone interviewed for the documentary struggled with emotion as they told various parts of the story of what they saw that horrible day. You can bet not a single one of these heroes will ever forget Darisabel's name.
It was literally like someone just hit me with a sledgehammer in the stomach. You know, all bets are off. I need to find out what happened here. Because the mother made a statement to me about, well, she fell, or this happened, or that happened. And I remember the first words out of my mouth were, bullshit. You better tell me what happened.
When we got to the top of the steps, there was no preparing for what we saw.
Because it was like, I think it was like a mutual feeling that we both wanted to say at the same time, what the happened here? Even under the dim light that there was in there, you couldn't believe the amount of injury this child had.
The best way I could describe it is almost like camouflage.
There were bruises on her body that were in different states of healing. If not, some were fresh, some were old, some were blue, some were black, some were yellow, some were green, some were red because they were bleeding. We assessed her. She had no pulse, no respirations. So I gave a couple rescue breaths, and I didn't realize that that she had been battered inside her mouth until I gave her the rescue breaths, and that's when I could taste her blood, and that sort of got to me.
The overriding thought process I had at the time was, this kid's got to live. You know, job, family, friends, didn't matter at that moment. Just wanted her to live.
I just took her. And like I said, she was very limp. I mean, her arms, it was obvious to me, but without being verbal about it, it was very obvious. She was gone. And I held her, but I ran down those steps. And there was just so many people. And I say so many, it could have been 10 or 50. It just seemed like a lot of people outside. And they were all just staring. And it just didn't make sense to me. So I grabbed her and I covered her. Because again, she's still naked. And I covered her, and I covered her face with my chest. And I held her up here. Because I don't want anyone to see her. Not like this. So I laid her on the gurney, and the medical people started, but there was no way I was leaving this child. There was no way at all.
Well, I asked the mom, what happened? And she said she fell down the steps. I said, this girl did not fall down the steps. What happened? And after about 5 or 10 minutes of me telling her that did not happen. You need to tell us the truth, pleading with her. Then she changed it and up a little bit and told me more of the truth. She basically said that Harve had beaten this child for 45 minutes in a room that he locked her out of, which I found out later was absolutely a lie. Door wasn't locked, door was open, and she watched this happen and did nothing. Miss Baez sees that he has that controller in his hand. She could hear that cord whiz through the air and then the smack of it against skin time and time again, and her child screaming and hollering and crying. And you know that the only thing she was doing was screaming for her mommy. And for 45 minutes, until she couldn't even breathe anymore, and he beat her to death, is when this child stopped screaming.
I took her little hand, and I'm just rubbing her hand. And you could see her nails are black and missing from her fingers. And I wanted everything. Any bit of life I had in me, I would have given this child.
What we experienced was pure evil, and I won't bring that home to my kids. Not raw evil like that.
You can't go home to your wife or husband or your kids and tell them about a 2-year-old girl or a 3-year-old girl beat to death when you're having problems dealing with it and not breaking down crying.
I was just in a rage within myself.
But you were so sad for this child, so unbelievably shaken to your core.
The things that had happened to her, it was just heartbreaking.
You know, why can't I keep this girl from being hurt?
Because this child was robbed not only of her life, but her innocence.
Her innocence. Even I feel guilty, just because
we couldn't save her.
We couldn't save her.
My daughter probably got a few extra hugs that day.
There should be a Darisabel Baez annual something to memorialize this child.
There's still part of me that says you should have been there.
Everybody should know Darisabel Baez's name. Everybody.
To the end of my career as a law enforcement officer. You'll live with it. I'll live for it forever.
And everybody should know that if you see a child who you suspect has been neglected or abused, that is the name that should just enter into your mind.
Sometimes there's just that look saying, you know, yeah, we haven't forgotten.
You should think about her story, think about what she went through, and so that people know that this child's life didn't just go and it's gone, and that it meant something.
Carrying Darisabel went on to win a number of awards, including a Mid-Atlantic Emmy and Editor and Publishers International Epi Award in the category of Best Enterprise or Investigative Video. After screening the documentary, York Counts, a committee seeking to strengthen York County by assessing the needs of its residents, dealing with critical issues, and obtaining measurable results, sponsored a summit of state and local officials to find solutions to York County's disproportionately high rate of child abuse. In conjunction with the York Daily Record, York Counts scheduled the summit called After Darisabel, Reducing Child Abuse in York County for June 10, 2010 at the York Jewish Community Center. Spokesman Dan Fink told the Daily Record, I'm a believer in using film, particularly one as powerful as this one, to get people thinking about an issue. "40-year-old Harve Lamar Johnson, Pennsylvania Department of Corrections inmate number JG7444, is currently incarcerated in SCI Phoenix, a prison located in Skipack Township where some men sentenced to death in Pennsylvania are housed. One current notable inmate is Joshua Kamasarjevsky, one of 2 men who committed the horrific home invasion murders of 48-year-old Jennifer Hawk Pettit and her 2 daughters, 17-year-old Haley and 11-year-old Michaela, in Cheshire, Connecticut in July of 2007. Formerly convicted sex offender and disgraced actor and comedian Bill Cosby was also an inmate at SCI Phoenix until his conviction was vacated in June of 2021 by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Although the state of Pennsylvania considers death a valid penalty under state law, no executions have been carried out in the state since 1999, and before that only 3 occurred since 1976, all of which were carried out by lethal injection. The last person executed in the state was infamous serial killer Gary Heidnick in July of 1999. Heidnick was sentenced to death for the kidnap, rape, and torture of 6 women he kept prisoner in the basement of his Philadelphia home. There are currently over 150 inmates on death row in Pennsylvania. In February of 2015, Governor Tom Wolf declared a moratorium on state executions, although death warrants are still issued by the court system when a jury hands down a death sentence. For example, prosecutors in Berks County have announced their intent to seek the death penalty against Lisa Rochelle Snyder, the mother of 8-year-old Connor and 4-year-old Brinley Snyder, whose story I told in episode 29 of this podcast. If Lisa is convicted, and if the jury hands down a death sentence, it is unlikely she will ever be executed by the state. The same goes for Harve Johnson, who will likely rot in prison for the rest of his natural life, which I think is exactly what he deserves. From what I've been able to gather, I believe Neida Elizabeth Baez, who is now 33 years old, was paroled from the Pennsylvania State Correctional Institute in Cambridge Springs in October of 2013. She appears to have laid low since then, but I believe she is still living in York and going by the name Elizabeth Torres, and it appears she now has a son who is about 2.5 years old as of this recording. We can only hope she's learned her lesson and protects this child the way she should have protected her daughter so many years ago. Darisabel's grave is marked with a flat, gray stone featuring a brass plaque shaped like a teddy bear. In the center is a color photo of tiny Darisabel sitting on the ground next to a baby deer that appears to be nuzzling her face. The inscription reads, Darisabel L. Baez, April 5th, 2006 to April 7th, 2008. Sing to you, my rainbow. Very little is known about Darisabel as a person. By all accounts, she was a happy, playful little girl whose smile could light up a room and whose big brown eyes captivated anyone who had the privilege of meeting her. A cousin posted in the Facebook group called Darisabel, Gone But Not Forgotten, that Darisabel was a very good girl and always extremely polite, saying please and thank you. It's incredibly important to me that Darisabel is not only remembered for the tragic way her life ended, but also as the happy, beautiful little girl she was. If Darisabel Leanna Baez was alive today, she would be celebrating her Sweet 16 on April 5th, 2022. I have no doubt she would be just as gorgeous and sweet now as she was when she died almost 14 years ago. Rest well, precious girl. You'll never be forgotten. My sources for this episode were the York Daily Record, NBC News, court documents, FindLink, the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections website, the documentary Carrying Darisabel, ABC 13 Eyewitness News, Legacy.com, the York blog, the Demon's Den forums, YorkCounts.org, the Find a Death forums, Wikipedia, Web Sleuths, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Fox 43, Pittsburgh's Action News 4, and the Pennsylvania Unified Judicial System web portal. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another story. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes or become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter and TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook and Instagram. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Laine. All music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlechildren.pod@gmail.com. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. If you see something, say something. Until next week, bye everyone.